June 1944, the Western Pacific, midnight. The sea is calm, black as polished obsidian, the horizon glowing faintly under a moon veiled by thin clouds. The Japanese destroyer Taman Maru No. 5 plows through the dark water at 18 knots, her bow slicing the waves into white foam. Above deck, the watchmen scan the ocean, their eyes weary after weeks of convoy duty. Below, the engineer wipes sweat from his brow, unaware of the silence gathering beneath them. 400 feet down, a U.S. submarine lies in perfect stillness, USS Seahorse. Her captain, Commander Sladecutter, watches through the periscope. This time, there is no uncertainty. The torpedoes in his tubes are not the flawed weapons that once failed him. These are the corrected Mark 14s, tested, tuned, lethal. Fire 1, fire 2. Two silver shapes dart into the darkness. Seconds later, the sea erupts. A blinding flash. The destroyer's bow lifts, fractures, and vanishes into flame. The explosion rolls across the water, echoing for miles. Above the roar, one thought remains. The nightmare that Japan had long dismissed has finally come alive beneath the waves. In the years before the Pacific War, few in Washington or Tokyo could imagine that a weapon no longer than a truck would decide the fate of fleets. Naval power was measured in battleships and carriers, symbols of might and prestige, while torpedoes were regarded merely as tools of opportunity. Yet within their sleek, mechanical bodies lay the invisible future of naval warfare. For the United States Navy, that future began poorly. On the eve of World War II, the U.S. submarine force placed its faith in the Mark 14 torpedo and its advanced magnetic detonator, the Mark 6 exploder. Both were the pride of the Bureau of Ordnance, products of a peacetime system obsessed with theory and secrecy. Tests had been limited, trials staged under ideal conditions, and reports of flaws buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. The weapon's performance, on paper, was flawless. Reality would be brutal. When war erupted after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American submarines were dispatched across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Java, to intercept Japan's vast network of supply and warships. The men who manned these boats were skilled, courageous, and ready to strike back. But their confidence soon met betrayal. Torpedoes struck targets with audible clangs and failed to explode. Others ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath enemy keels. Some even circled back, threatening the very submarines that fired them. By mid-1942, submarine commanders filed increasingly desperate reports. Hits observed, no detonation, ran beneath target. Premature explosion. Yet, at Pearl Harbor and Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance refused to accept the evidence. Engineers insisted the weapons were perfect, blaming operators for errors. The Navy's technical establishment was bound by pride, unwilling to admit that its most trusted creation was sabotaging the war effort. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, Japanese naval officers observed these failures with a mixture of contempt and amusement. In their eyes, American torpedoes symbolized Western over-engineering, complex, unreliable, and timid. Japan's own Type 93, Long Lance, torpedo, fueled by pure oxygen, was the marvel of the world. It could reach 40 knots and strike from over 20 kilometers away, deadly, silent, and devastating. At the Battle of Java Sea and later at Savo Island, it carved through Allied cruisers with terrifying precision. Japanese admirals believed their mastery of torpedo warfare would guarantee naval dominance for decades. The Long Lance became a symbol of technological superiority and national pride. The perfect embodiment of the Yamato spirit, disciplined, fearless, and precise. American torpedoes, by comparison, appeared weak and amateurish. Reports of dud hits reinforced the stereotype of a clumsy industrial power relying on quantity over quality. But deep beneath the humiliation of failure, a quiet anger was growing among U.S. submarine commanders. Men like Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton of Wahoo and Commander Charles Swede Momsen began questioning not their crews, but the weapons themselves. They knew that courage and skill were worthless if the tools of war could not deliver. Every failed attack meant wasted risk, lost opportunities, and dead sailors. The Pacific was vast, but word spread fast through the submarine force. Captains shared stories of failures, compared field data, and conducted their own unauthorized tests. Each new patrol revealed the same pattern: torpedoes ran 10 feet deeper than set, magnetic detonators triggered prematurely, and contact exploders failed on direct impact. The evidence was overwhelming, but still, the Bureau resisted. It was not until late 1942 that the truth began to break through the shield of denial. By then, Japan's empire had reached its zenith. From Burma to the Solomons, imperial forces controlled the Pacific's strategic arteries. Convoys from Southeast Asia carried oil, rubber, and metals to the home islands. The Japanese Navy guarded these routes with deadly precision, confident that America's underwater threat was little more than an annoyance. Few realized that beneath the frustration and silence, a transformation was beginning within the U.S. Navy's undersea arm. A transformation born of anger, persistence, and the unbearable cost of failure. And by the time Japan noticed it, it would already be too late. By early 1943, the frustration of American submarine crews had reached a breaking point. Patrol reports accumulated like evidence in a courtroom, each describing torpedoes that ran too deep, detonated prematurely, or simply failed to explode. On board every submarine, men whispered the same question: how could the Bureau of Ordnance continue to trust weapons that betrayed them at every turn? The answer lay partly in institutional inertia. Washington's Navy bureaucracy was vast and rigid, unwilling to admit errors. Tests conducted in controlled bays or shallow waters were considered definitive, even when real-world performance proved disastrous. Commanders in the field became both investigators and victims, forced to find workarounds while risking lives on each patrol. They improvised, using tactics to compensate for faulty torpedoes, firing closer to targets, aiming for bows or sterns, timing salvos to maximize chances of a kill. Every patrol became an experiment in survival. Meanwhile, the Imperial Japanese Navy remained unaware of the full extent of American ingenuity. The Type 93 torpedo reinforced their overconfidence, allowing Japanese ships to operate aggressively, often in daylight, under the belief that no submarine threat could seriously challenge them. Convoys sailed with minimal concern for torpedo attacks. Naval officers saw U.S. submarines as inconsistent nuisances, more frustrating than deadly. Even when American submarines scored hits, the destruction seemed minimal compared to Japan's vast maritime network. Yet, beneath the surface, American industry quietly prepared a reckoning. Engineers redesigned the Mark 14, correcting depth mechanisms, strengthening contact exploders, and reconfiguring magnetic triggers to prevent premature detonation. Field modifications were tested rigorously on captured vessels and in open ocean trials. By mid-1943, submarines began leaving port with torpedoes that finally matched the skill of the crews. The first successes were subtle. A freighter here, a destroyer there, moments that seemed inconsequential to distant commanders in Tokyo. But for submarine crews, each sinking was vindication. Months of frustration, near mutiny, and professional humiliation coalesced into a quiet, determined confidence. The tools of war, once unreliable, now became extensions of human skill and courage. Japanese intelligence, however, remained blind. Analysts assumed that sporadic losses were random, caused by mines, aircraft, or chance. They continued to dismiss the Americans as technologically inferior, underestimating the systemic shift taking place under the waves. This misjudgment was costly. Japan's naval strategy, predicated on a combination of overwhelming firepower and secure supply lines, failed to account for a submarine force growing stronger by the day. By late 1943, reports from U.S. submarines reached Washington with undeniable evidence. Corrected torpedoes were hitting targets reliably, and sinkings were escalating. Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, implemented new tactics to maximize their impact. Wolfpack formations, aggressive night surface attacks, and coordinated assaults on convoys began to turn the tide. The torpedo, once a symbol of failure and bureaucratic arrogance, became a decisive instrument of war. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it easy. Every patrol demanded risk, precision, and nerve. Crews remembered the months of frustration when victories slipped through their fingers due to mechanical flaws. The emotional toll was immense, yet these trials forged a generation of submariners who were both technically proficient and ruthlessly determined. By early 1944, the combination of improved weapons, daring tactics, and industrial might allow American submarines to strike with devastating effect. Convoys carrying vital oil, rubber, and metals to Japan were now easy targets. Every sunken freighter compounded Japan's logistical crisis, eroding the empire's ability to wage war. The psychological blow to the Japanese Navy, once confident in its supremacy, was mounting, though they had yet to grasp the full scale of the threat lurking beneath the Pacific waves. The stage was set. Japan's overconfidence, the result of earlier American failures, would now meet the reality of relentless technological adaptation and unyielding determination. The very weapon they had dismissed, the torpedo, would become the instrument of their undoing. The submarine crews who had suffered through frustration and disbelief were ready. The Americans who had learned, adapted, and persisted were about to turn the tide of the Pacific War, one sinking at a time. The men who manned the submarines carried a burden heavier than any torpedo tube could hold. For months, they faced the cruel irony of seeing enemy ships exposed, vulnerable, and yet untouchable because their own weapons betrayed them. In the cramped steel hulls of Gaito and Balao-class submarines, tension was constant. Officers and enlisted men lived shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and the omnipresent scent of salt. Every missed hit gnawed at morale. Each failed torpedo became a story of frustration, whispered quietly in the mess, recounted during briefings, a grim reminder that skill alone could not win the war. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, commanding USS Wahoo, remembered a night in 1942 when 6 torpedoes struck a Japanese freighter. None detonated. The vessel sailed on, indifferent to the American attack. For the crew, the silence of the explosions was deafening, a lesson in both helplessness and patience. These moments forged resilience. Crews learned to adapt, to improvise firing angles, and to trust one another implicitly. Human courage was constantly tested, and the eventual triumphs, when a torpedo finally struck home, were both professional vindication and emotional release. The torpedo itself was an instrument of both genius and frustration. The Mark 14, equipped with the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, was a marvel on paper. Engineers designed it to detect a ship's magnetic field and detonate beneath the hull, maximizing damage through catastrophic shock. Yet real-world conditions rendered these systems unreliable. Depth control mechanisms were miscalibrated, torpedoes ran 10 feet too deep, a critical error against slender hulls. Magnetic triggers detonated prematurely, or sometimes not at all, leaving crews to confront targets that were simultaneously within reach and untouchable. The redesign process demanded meticulous work. Field tests were conducted under extreme conditions: open ocean firings, repeated calibration against stationary and moving targets, and adjustments for salinity and temperature. By late 1943, the modifications were complete, depth mechanisms corrected, magnetic exploders stabilized, and contact detonators reinforced. Torpedoes finally performed as intended, transforming from unreliable tools into lethal instruments capable of striking the Japanese Navy's supply lines with deadly precision. Admiral Charles Lockwood emerges as the pivotal figure in this narrative of adaptation and persistence. Appointed commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, Lockwood faced entrenched bureaucratic resistance and a culture that doubted front-line reports. He instituted rigorous testing, demanded field verification, and, crucially, listened to his submarine commanders. Lockwood's insistence on accuracy over protocol allowed the force to overcome years of institutional failure. He deployed aggressive tactics: night surface attacks, coordinated wolf packs, and bold maneuvers in enemy-controlled waters. His leadership not only validated the struggles of submarine crews but amplified their effectiveness. By empowering his officers and demanding accountability from his engineers, Lockwood transformed the submarine fleet from a frustrated, underperforming arm of the Navy into a decisive strategic weapon. From the Japanese perspective, the Americans remained beneath estimation. Overconfidence in the Type 93 Long Lance and early victories had fostered a dangerous hubris. Japanese officers assumed that torpedo strikes were random acts of chance rather than the product of a disciplined, technologically improving opponent. Convoys sailed with minimal precaution. Even when submarines were encountered, Japanese gunners often failed to press the attack aggressively, believing any hits were accidental or inconsequential. This arrogance created blind spots. Each unanticipated loss further destabilized Japanese logistics and morale. The enemy's failure to recognize the evolving capability of American torpedoes allowed submarines to operate with relative impunity, striking critical targets and sowing chaos in the once secure maritime arteries of the empire. The emotional toll on submarine crews cannot be overstated. Every failed attack, every dud torpedo, compounded the sense of helplessness in a war fought beneath the waves. Yet these frustrations cultivated an extraordinary resilience. Sailors developed an almost spiritual commitment to precision and patience. The eventual correction of the Mark 14 torpedo was not merely a technological achievement. It was a moral vindication. Each sinking of a Japanese vessel carried with it a quiet, profound satisfaction. The torpedo became a symbol of justice, through persistence a reward for human ingenuity, courage, and the refusal to accept systemic failure. For the men who had suffered through months of failure, the torpedo's deadly accuracy was proof that perseverance could overcome even the most formidable obstacles. The experiences of men, technology, leadership, and enemy misjudgment all converged to set the stage for a decisive shift in the Pacific. Submarine warfare was no longer an experiment or a gamble. It had become the instrument through which the Japanese Empire would first feel the consequences of underestimation and denial. The success of American torpedoes was not only a triumph of ingenuity at sea but also of industry on land. U.S. manufacturing infrastructure had long been underestimated by Japan, which relied on precision, tradition, and limited-scale production. In contrast, American factories churned out components, conducted extensive testing, and adapted designs with unprecedented speed. Once the flaws in the Mark 14 and Mark 6 were recognized, production lines were retooled, engineering teams reorganized, and new quality control protocols instituted. Submarine crews soon discovered the benefits. Torpedoes arriving at Pearl Harbor were no longer inconsistent. They had uniform specifications, calibrated exploders, and reliability tested under rigorous conditions. Each torpedo was a product of both technological insight and industrial might, proof that a nation capable of mass production could correct errors faster than any opponent could exploit them. This industrial backbone would allow the U.S. Navy to sustain relentless attacks on Japanese shipping lanes, systematically eroding the logistical foundation of the empire. With torpedoes finally performing as intended, American submarines refined their tactics. Wolfpack formations allowed multiple boats to coordinate attacks on convoys, maximizing the number of torpedoes striking simultaneously. Night surface attacks took advantage of superior optics and radar, letting submarines approach within striking distance undetected. Commanders emphasized patience, firing only when conditions guaranteed maximum effectiveness. These tactical innovations leveraged the corrected Mark 14 torpedoes' capabilities to full effect. Submarines became agile predators, capable of striking anywhere in the Pacific with lethal precision. The combination of human skill, refined tactics, and technological reliability meant that what had once been random, sporadic attacks now became calculated, devastating blows to Japanese supply chains. The transformation of submarine warfare had strategic consequences that rippled across the Pacific. By late 1943, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships at an unprecedented rate. Oil, rubber, rice, and metals failed to reach Japan, strangling its war economy. Every ton of lost cargo weakened the ability of the Japanese Navy to maintain its fleet, supply garrisons, and project power. Strategists in Tokyo faced a dilemma. Their initial calculations, which had dismissed U.S. undersea capabilities, now proved disastrously wrong. Japan's overconfidence in traditional naval power, battleships, carriers, and the long-lance torpedo, could not compensate for the sudden and relentless attrition of essential resources. The strategic landscape shifted quietly but inexorably. The empire's industrial heart was vulnerable, and its naval arteries were under siege. For Japanese sailors and officers, the psychological shock of American torpedo effectiveness was profound. Months of victories had fostered an illusion of invincibility. Yet increasingly, convoys vanished, escorts were destroyed, and supply lines became perilous. The realization that an underestimated enemy had mastered a previously flawed weapon created both fear and confusion. This psychological dimension amplified the material impact of the submarine campaign. Japanese commanders became more conservative, routing ships cautiously, increasing escort deployment, and avoiding exposed routes. Each adjustment, however, could not fully counter the relentless pressure of a U.S. submarine force that had adapted faster than Japan could respond. The human mind, like industry and tactics, became a battlefield. Confidence eroded, hesitation grew, and the perception of invulnerability cracked. The leadership displayed by submarine commanders in the Pacific extended beyond strategy and tactics. Their ability to innovate, share knowledge, and exploit the weaknesses of both enemy and bureaucracy was central to success. Officers like Morton, Cutler, and James Fife exemplified leadership that fused technical expertise with moral courage. They challenged assumptions, pressed for accountability, and demonstrated the effectiveness of informed, proactive command. Lockwood's guidance provided a framework for this decentralized initiative. He understood that frontline leaders were best positioned to identify problems and craft solutions. By empowering commanders while maintaining overall strategic cohesion, he created a force capable of exploiting every advantage: industrial, technological, tactical, and psychological. Leadership became the glue holding together all facets of the submarine revolution. The convergence of human skill, industrial capacity, tactical innovation, leadership, and enemy misjudgment created a turning point in undersea warfare. Each element reinforced the others, setting the stage for a decisive transformation in the Pacific. Submarine attacks were no longer isolated events of frustration or chance; they became coordinated instruments of strategic annihilation. The stage was now set for the climactic phase, the moment when American torpedoes, once dismissed as unreliable, would systematically destroy the Imperial Japanese Navy and redefine naval warfare in the Pacific. By late 1943, the U.S. submarine force had transformed from a frustrated, underperforming arm into a lethal predator operating across the vast Pacific. The combination of corrected torpedoes, tactical innovation, and experienced crews was beginning to pay dividends. Every patrol brought confirmation that months of struggle had not been in vain. Ships that once survived multiple torpedo hits now sank in minutes, leaving burning hulks drifting through the night. One of the earliest signs of this turning point occurred in October 1943, when USS Wahoo and USS Seadragon intercepted a Japanese convoy en route from Truk to the Marianas. For the first time, all torpedoes functioned reliably. Commander Morton executed a textbook night attack, 6 torpedoes fired at a heavily escorted transport group. Explosions erupted in rapid succession. Japanese destroyers attempted to retaliate, but precision and surprise ensured American submarines escaped unscathed. The engagement marked more than a tactical victory; it was proof that human ingenuity, supported by corrected technology, could defeat even the most confident enemy. Meanwhile, Admiral Charles Lockwood oversaw a broader strategic shift. He coordinated Wolfpack operations, concentrating submarines against key supply routes in the Central and South Pacific. Patrols were meticulously planned, timing angles, and firing sequences calculated to maximize destruction while minimizing risk. By mid-1944, these tactics had begun to cripple Japanese shipping. Convoys that had once sailed with impunity were now systematically intercepted. Every ton of cargo loss struck not only the fleet's operational capacity, but also Japan's morale. The transformation of the torpedo itself played a central role in these successes. The Mark 14's depth problems had been corrected, contact exploders reinforced, and the Mark 6 magnetic trigger stabilized. By late 1943, the Mark 18 electric torpedo was introduced, further expanding tactical options. Silent and faster than its predecessors, it could approach undetected and strike without warning. Submarine commanders quickly integrated it into attacks, combining traditional Mark 14 salvos with the new weapon to maximize hits. Japanese forces, accustomed to the invincibility of the long lance and the perceived inefficiency of U.S. torpedoes, were slow to respond. Convoy escorts found themselves under constant, unpredictable attack. Destroyers designed to protect transports now faced the terror of accurate, lethal weapons. By late 1943, intelligence reports confirmed rising losses. Yet, Japanese high command still underestimated the scope and speed of American adaptation. USS Seahorse, commanded by Slade Cutter, exemplified the new era of undersea warfare. Operating off the Philippine Sea, cutters' patrols combined stealth, tactical ingenuity, and technological reliability. On one night in December 1943, Seahorse encountered a Japanese task force of 4 destroyers and a transport. With the Mark 14 torpedoes performing perfectly, cutter executed a daring night surface attack. 2 destroyers were disabled within minutes, the transport engulfed in flames, and the remaining vessels scattered. The victory sent shockwaves through Japanese naval intelligence. The psychological impact of these successes was profound. Submarine crews, long demoralized by defective weapons, now carried the quiet confidence of a force reborn. Each successful strike reinforced training, tactics, and morale. Conversely, Japanese sailors grew increasingly wary. Convoys traveled with heightened tension, vigilant for an enemy they had long dismissed. Fear, once absent, began to dictate movement, forcing changes in strategy that could not prevent further losses. By early 1944, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. The Philippine Sea, the Marianas, and the South China Sea became hunting grounds where American submarines struck at will. Lockwood's coordination ensured that no major convoy moved without risk. From the largest oil tankers to the smallest cargo vessels, Japanese maritime logistics faltered. Every sinking compounded material shortages, delaying fuel shipments, munitions, and reinforcements critical to Japan's war effort. This period also highlighted the strategic genius of combining technological reliability with human innovation. Corrected torpedoes were not merely improved weapons, they were instruments of transformation. The months of testing, field adjustments, and industrial refinement had created a system in which tactics, technology, and leadership intersected perfectly. Submarines no longer relied on chance, they relied on precision, planning, and relentless execution. The stage was now set for the next, decisive phase. What began as incremental improvements, corrected torpedoes, improved tactics, and courageous leadership, would soon culminate in a series of engagements that would devastate the Imperial Japanese Navy. The tools that Japan had once mocked as ineffective were now rewriting the rules of naval warfare in the Pacific. By mid-1944, the transformation of American submarine warfare had reached its zenith. Japan's once unassailable supply lines were now open hunting grounds, and every sinking struck at the very heart of the empire's war effort. Convoys carrying oil from Borneo, rice from the Philippines, and metals from the Dutch East Indies were systematically intercepted. American submarines, armed with fully reliable torpedoes, executed coordinated attacks with precision that the Japanese Navy had not anticipated. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, while often remembered for carrier aviation, underscored the growing menace of the undersea threat. American submarines patrolled the surrounding waters, picking off transport ships and escorts that attempted to reinforce the fleet. The Japanese Navy, overconfident in its fleet strength and long-lance torpedoes, struggled to adapt to the invisible danger beneath them. Every sinking eroded their capacity to maintain strategic positions, leaving carriers and battleships increasingly isolated. USS Albacore, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Enright, exemplified the lethal efficiency now possible. Patrolling the shipping lanes between Palau and the Philippines, Albacore encountered a convoy of 8 cargo ships with 6 escorts. Using a combination of the Mark 14 and the new electric Mark 18 torpedoes, Enright executed a night surface attack. Within 30 minutes, 4 freighters were ablaze, 2 escorts disabled, and the remainder scattered into the darkness. The operation cost his submarine no casualties. News of the engagement spread quickly through submarine ranks, a signal that America's undersea campaign was both unstoppable and devastating. Japanese high command faced mounting losses that were impossible to ignore. By late 1944, convoys were being destroyed at unprecedented rates, sometimes as high as 50% of cargo vessels on a given route. The loss of critical fuel shipments disrupted fleet operations, forcing Japanese carriers to limit sorties and battleships to conserve fuel. Industrial output at home could not compensate for the relentless attrition at sea. Even the vaunted Type 93 torpedo, long a symbol of Japanese technological superiority, could not counter the relentless and increasingly coordinated American attacks. The Leyte Gulf campaign in October 1944 further highlighted the devastating effect of improved torpedoes. American submarines positioned ahead of and around the Japanese task forces intercepted reinforcements and supply ships en route to the Philippines. Every successful attack compounded the Japanese Navy's logistical and psychological crisis. Destroyers meant to protect convoys became targets themselves, while transport ships were sent to the bottom with alarming frequency. The combined effect of reliable torpedoes and aggressive tactics was strategic paralysis. Japan could no longer safely move men or materials to critical theaters of war. USS Barb, under Commander Eugene Fluckey, demonstrated the apex of American innovation and audacity. Operating in the waters off Honshu in 1945, Barb executed a daring coastal raid on Japanese shipping. Using torpedoes to strike industrial and naval targets, the submarine sank multiple cargo ships, destroying vital supplies and crippling local ports. Fluckey's patrol showcased the culmination of years of learning, tactical daring, technological precision, and leadership that maximized every advantage. By the end of the war, operations like these had inflicted irreparable damage on Japan's maritime infrastructure. The human dimension of these attacks was profound. Submarine crews, hardened by months of prior failure, now experienced the full vindication of their perseverance. Each sinking was not only a tactical victory but also a moral one, demonstrating the efficacy of courage, innovation, and relentless discipline. Conversely, the Japanese Navy, once confident in its mastery of the seas, now faced demoralization. Every loss underscored the vulnerability created by underestimating an enemy and the consequences of technological complacency. By early 1945, the pattern was unmistakable. The American submarine force, wielding perfected torpedoes and led by bold commanders, had transformed the Pacific theater. Japan's merchant fleet, once a lifeline for the empire, lay in ruin. Fuel shortages crippled naval operations. Supply lines could not be secured, and reinforcements to distant garrisons were delayed or destroyed en route. The Japanese Navy, despite bravery and experience, was incapable of recovering from the systematic undersea assault. The climactic lesson was clear: adaptation, persistence, and technological mastery could overturn years of complacency and arrogance. The torpedo, once dismissed as flawed and unreliable, had become the instrument through which an empire's naval supremacy was shattered. American ingenuity, industry, and courage converged in a series of decisive strikes that changed the trajectory of the war in the Pacific. The stage was set for the aftermath: a once dominant Imperial Navy rendered impotent, the consequences of misjudged technology fully realized, and the human and strategic costs of the torpedo revolution revealed in stark, indisputable terms. By mid-1945, the impact of the American submarine campaign was undeniable. Japan's once mighty merchant fleet had been reduced to fragments. Cargo ships carrying oil, rice, metals, and military supplies sank at alarming rates. By some estimates, American submarines were responsible for the destruction of over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping, roughly 55% of the pre-war merchant fleet. Fuel shortages grounded warships, starved industrial centers, and disrupted military operations across the Pacific. The effectiveness of the torpedo campaign extended beyond sheer numbers. Convoys that had once moved with impunity now faced constant, unpredictable attacks. Escort vessels, intended to protect supply lines, were overwhelmed or destroyed, leaving transport ships vulnerable to precise, coordinated strikes. The psychological toll on Japanese sailors was immense. Officers reported increased anxiety and hesitancy in routing convoys. Even minor losses created cascading logistical complications. Shipments of ammunition and fuel were delayed, critical reinforcements failed to reach strategic islands, and entire campaigns were jeopardized before they began. Submarine crews, for their part, experienced both vindication and exhaustion. Months of frustration caused by faulty Mark 14s and bureaucratic neglect had forged extraordinary resilience and expertise. Sailors who once doubted the efficacy of their weapons now witnessed firsthand the lethal consequences of technological mastery. Each sinking validated years of struggle, innovation, and patience, reinforcing a sense of purpose that would define the U.S. submarine force for the remainder of the war. The Japanese Navy, meanwhile, confronted the stark reality of its miscalculations. The long-lance torpedo, once the jewel of the Imperial fleet, could not compensate for the systematic destruction of supply lines by American submarines. Fleet operations became increasingly constrained as fuel shortages and logistical insecurity forced commanders to limit sorties and adopt defensive postures. Naval dominance, which had been virtually uncontested in the early years of the war, was now unattainable. Japan's maritime strategy, predicated on secure supply routes and the assumed inferiority of American torpedoes, had been fatally undermined. The broader consequences were equally significant. By crippling Japan's ability to move men and materials, American submarines indirectly supported campaigns by land and air forces across the Pacific. Island invasions, carrier operations, and bombing missions all benefited from the reduced mobility and logistical capacity of Japanese forces. Historians later noted that the submarine campaign, though smaller in scale than carrier battles, was arguably the most strategically decisive aspect of the Pacific War. Without reliable torpedoes and the men to wield them, these cumulative successes would have been impossible. Reports from surviving Japanese officers after the war emphasized the psychological dimension of the attacks. One admiral noted, "We underestimated the Americans at sea. We dismissed their weapons, we dismissed their skill, and we paid the price. Every ship lost was a lesson we could not learn in time." Their words underscored a critical failure. The combination of arrogance, misjudgment, and technological denial had allowed an enemy to exploit a vulnerability that had once seemed trivial. In Washington, the Navy documented these achievements meticulously. The corrected Mark 14, the Mark 18 electric torpedo, and the operational doctrines that guided their deployment were celebrated not just as technical triumphs but as decisive strategic innovations. Submarine commanders received recognition for their audacity and skill, while the lessons of bureaucratic rigidity and delayed adaptation informed post-war naval planning. The campaign demonstrated that technological mastery, human initiative, and leadership, when combined effectively, could overcome even the most formidable adversaries. The consequences extended beyond material losses. Japan's naval prestige, previously a symbol of national pride and military competence, was shattered. Convoy failures and fleet vulnerabilities exposed systemic weaknesses, eroding morale and confidence in leadership. Sailors and officers alike understood that their invulnerability had been an illusion, one that American persistence, ingenuity, and technological adaptation had cruelly exploited. In sum, by mid-1945, the Pacific had been irrevocably transformed. American torpedoes, once dismissed as unreliable, had become instruments of total strategic disruption. The Imperial Japanese Navy, despite its experience and prior dominance, faced a reality where industrial capacity, technological adaptation, and human courage combined to achieve overwhelming superiority. The stage was set for the final chapters of the war, in which Japan's inability to recover from undersea attrition would contribute decisively to its ultimate defeat. By late 1945, the full scale of the American submarine campaign's devastation had become undeniable. Japanese naval infrastructure, once a symbol of technological prowess and strategic dominance, lay in ruins. Supply lines that had allowed the empire to expand across Southeast Asia and the Pacific were all but destroyed. Every port, every convoy, every freighter that had survived early American attacks now faced near certain peril. The cumulative effect of reliable torpedoes and skilled crews had effectively strangled Japan's maritime lifelines. Japanese officers documented the consequences with grim clarity. Rear Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, in post-war interrogations, recalled the sudden realization that their earlier confidence was misplaced. "We had underestimated them at every level. Their courage, their ingenuity, and their persistence. What we dismissed as minor failures in our enemy's arsenal became the instrument of our undoing." Convoys carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies were reduced to smoldering wrecks. Reinforcements intended for the Philippines and the Marianas were destroyed at sea, leaving garrisons isolated and vulnerable. Every lost ship compounded a logistical crisis that Japan's war planners could neither mitigate nor reverse. The human cost was mirrored on both sides. For American submariners, the campaign was exhausting but vindicating. Crews who had endured the humiliation of defective torpedoes finally witnessed the lethal consequences of their skill and perseverance. Many patrols lasted weeks under the constant threat of enemy depth charges, mechanical failure, and isolation. Yet by the end of the war, the effectiveness of each mission confirmed that their suffering had a profound impact, the destruction of the enemy's naval and supply capabilities. For Japanese sailors, the psychological toll was devastating. Losses became inevitable, unpredictable, and demoralizing. Convoys traveled under constant stress, with escorts that could not prevent devastation. Even seasoned officers struggled with the sudden reality: the Americans had not only mastered the torpedo, but had adapted their tactics, coordinated attacks, and used intelligence to lethal effect. What had once been dismissed as minor technological flaws now appeared as the decisive factor in the erosion of Japan's naval power. The industrial dimension of the campaign also bore fruit. American shipyards, ordnance facilities, and testing grounds had created a cycle of rapid adaptation. Defective torpedoes were replaced by improved Mark 14s, supplemented by the silent Mark 18 electric models. Submarines now carried a mixture of both, maximizing tactical flexibility. Engineers worked closely with commanders, testing weapons in realistic conditions and ensuring reliability under combat stress. The combination of industrial capacity, engineering precision, and battlefield feedback created a force multiplier that Japanese commanders could neither predict nor counter effectively. Statistically, the impact was staggering. By the war's end, U.S. submarines had sunk over 300 Japanese ships, accounting for nearly 60% of total Japanese tonnage lost at sea. Fuel shortages forced the Japanese Navy to curtail operations, isolating garrisons and delaying counteroffensives. Critical campaigns, from the Philippines to Okinawa, were influenced directly by the inability of Japan to move men and materials efficiently. What had begun as tactical adjustments at the torpedo level had evolved into a strategic collapse that contributed decisively to the outcome of the Pacific War. The campaign also provided enduring lessons for naval warfare. Reliability of weapons systems, the integration of technological feedback with tactical execution, and the empowerment of field commanders became central tenets of post-war doctrine. The United States Navy recognized that adaptation under fire, coupled with the industrial capacity to implement change rapidly, could transform minor tools into decisive instruments of strategy. Conversely, Japan's failure to reassess both human and technological assumptions revealed the dangers of overconfidence and inflexibility. Ultimately, the aftereffects of the submarine campaign extended beyond material destruction. Japanese naval prestige, once seemingly unassailable, was shattered. Confidence in command eroded, strategic flexibility diminished, and morale suffered. By systematically exploiting technological mastery and human initiative, the United States had not merely inflicted losses. It had rewritten the operational and psychological landscape of the Pacific theater. The stage was now set for the final chapter. Reflection on what this campaign meant for history, technology, and the human dimension of warfare. The torpedo, once dismissed as unreliable and inconsequential, had demonstrated its capacity to alter the course of nations. Its story would serve as a testament to the consequences of adaptation, perseverance, and the intersection of skill, leadership, and technology in modern warfare. The story of the American torpedo in the Pacific is, at its heart, a story of transformation. A weapon dismissed as flawed, unreliable, and inconsequential became the instrument through which an empire's naval supremacy unraveled. The Imperial Japanese Navy, confident in its technological prowess and early victories, learned too late that arrogance and denial carry consequences far beyond immediate battlefield losses. The torpedo, silent and unseen beneath the waves, became both a symbol and a mechanism of strategic reckoning. For the men who fired them, the journey was as personal as it was tactical. Submarine crews endured months of frustration, risk, and uncertainty. They confronted defective weapons, bureaucratic indifference, and the vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific. Yet through persistence, ingenuity, and discipline, they turned failure into mastery. Each sinking became more than a military achievement, it was vindication of human resolve. Proof that perseverance combined with skill and knowledge could alter the course of war. The campaign also illustrates the interplay between technology, industry, and leadership. Corrected Mark 14 and Mark 18 torpedoes were not merely improved weapons, they were products of rigorous testing, adaptive engineering, and an industrial ecosystem capable of sustaining rapid innovation. Admiral Lockwood's leadership ensured that these tools were wielded effectively, empowering commanders to exploit every advantage. Together, these factors created a force multiplier whose effects reverberated across the Pacific, crippling logistics, isolating fleets, and undermining morale. In the larger sweep of history, the campaign demonstrates a timeless truth: underestimation, bureaucratic rigidity, and overconfidence can be fatal. Conversely, adaptation, relentless pursuit of improvement, and the courage to act on evidence can redefine outcomes even against formidable odds. The torpedo, once dismissed and derided, became a decisive instrument of warfare. A lesson in humility, innovation, and the profound consequences of mastery beneath the waves. The Pacific War, shaped by countless battles and innovations, reminds us that victory often belongs not to the strongest or most confident, but to those who learn, adapt, and strike with precision when opportunity arises. In the silent depths, the torpedo told a story the world could not ignore: that persistence and ingenuity, guided by courage and skill, can reshape history itself.